In the icy waters of the Bering Sea, where the ice is more than 2 meters thick and temperatures drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius, Alaskan fishermen still risk their lives in a special hunt. King crabs, giant seafood that can bring in up to 1.2 million USD in just one short fishing season. But to haul up this treasure beneath the ice, they must drill through the thick ice, lower traps into the cold, dark seafloor, and struggle every day against fierce winds, breaking ice, and lurking dangers. What makes this crab species the red gold of the ocean? And how have Alaskan fishermen managed to claim it? The Bering Sea. The polar frontier of life and death. Every winter, when the Arctic winds sweep down, the Bering Sea off the coast of Alaska turns into a white ice desert. A layer of ice more than 2 meters thick covers the sea's surface, stretching to the horizon, as if determined to block every sign of life. Temperatures drop to minus 40 degrees Celsius, making even steel brittle and fractured, while human breath instantly freezes into shards of gray smoke. In that seemingly lifeless picture, small fleets of boats quietly leave the harbor, carrying with them the toughest men. They are not dreamers or seekers of glory, but Alaskan fishermen who regard facing death at sea as part of daily life in exchange for the chance to bring home a kind of red gold, the king crab. The harsh conditions here are not only a test of endurance, but also a measure of the survival of an economy tied to the very identity of Alaska. Fishing time is counted in weeks, not months, because the sea only opens for a very brief window before freezing completely. It is a race against nature, where every hour, every minute carries the weight of life and death. A loose plank, an unexpected ice crack, or a snowstorm rising on the horizon could turn the entire journey into tragedy. Yet what makes this scene haunting is not only nature's brutality, but also the stark contrast between poverty and opportunity, between risk and reward. One trip to sea could mean loss of human lives or of boats worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. But that same trip, if successful, could bring back immense earnings that few professions on land could ever rival. The king crab industry, therefore, is both a double-edged sword and a lottery ticket, one that Alaskans are forced to wager their lives on in order to seize a chance at prosperity. From a political economy perspective, the harshness of the Bering Sea is not merely a natural challenge. It is also a mirror reflecting how America exploits every last gift of nature and transforms it into a crucial component of the global market. It is no coincidence that Alaska, the land considered the most remote and inhospitable in the United States, has become the center, supplying up to 80% of the world's king crab. It is precisely this harshness that creates value, because what is rare, what is hard to obtain, always becomes a luxury commodity in the eyes of markets in Japan, Korea, or Europe. But looking deeper, the harshness not only sustains an industry, it also engraves the resilience of an entire community. Alaskans have long lived alongside the ice, treating endurance as capital and death looming overhead as something self-evident. They do not see it as tragedy, but as the condition for creating unique economic values found nowhere else. By confronting harshness head-on, they turn what seems destructive into a force for growth. From this deadly sea, an industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars was forged, sustaining not only fishermen, but also an entire value chain. From transport and processing to export, it could be said that the Bering Sea in winter is an economic frontier of the United States. It is not as noisy as Wall Street, nor as dazzling as Silicon Valley, but it lays bare an undeniable truth, that the American economy has always rested on laborers who accept risk, who sweat and bleed beneath the frozen ice. While debates over trade policies, tariffs, or resource conservation unfold in Washington, off the coast of Alaska livelihoods, and lives are decided with each strike of an ice drill, each trap lowered into the dark sea floor. And there, harshness is not merely a wall separating humans from nature, but also a test of will, of organization, and of long-term vision. For without careful preparation, without a strategy to seize the fleeting window nature allows, all efforts would become meaningless. The Bering Sea is therefore both a nightmare and a promised land, a place where only those resilient enough can reach the reward. The value of the red gold of the Bering Sea. If the bone-chilling cold and the thick ice on the Bering Sea are life-or-death barriers, then the immense value of king crab is the irresistible force that pulls ships back every season. In the world of seafood, few species combine all three elements: enormous size, unique flavor, and outstanding economic value, like the Alaskan king crab. It is not merely a product, but a symbol of luxury, a hard currency in the global market, and living proof of how harsh nature can be transformed into enormous profit. Each mature crab can weigh from 4 to 6 kilograms, with a leg span reaching up to 2 meters, an extraordinary size that makes it one of a kind. But what makes king crab a strategic commodity lies in its flavor. Firm, sweet meat with high nutritional value. On the dining tables of elites in Tokyo, Seoul, or Paris, the presence of king crab evokes not only delicious taste, but also a confirmation of social status. Therefore, its commercial value is pushed high, ranging from $50 to $60 per kilogram, a price comparable to many of the world's finest meats. At the macroeconomic level, a successful fishing trip brings Alaskan fishermen from $1 to $1.2 million. This figure is not only a personal reward, but also the lifeblood that sustains an entire supporting economic ecosystem. From processing plants along the ports, cold logistics systems for international transport, to foreign trade contracts signed with the most demanding markets. King crab, therefore, is not just seafood. It is a form of soft diplomacy, contributing to shaping America's position on the global seafood export map. What is remarkable is the stratification of value created by this species. While in Alaska, fishermen must trade sweat and danger to haul each trap from the dark seafloor. At the other end of the supply chain, diners enjoy the dish in luxurious settings, sipping it with fine wine. The $60 per kilogram price does not only cover extraction costs, but also reflects the scarcity and the mythologizing that the international market has draped over this crab. Consumers are not merely buying seafood, they are buying the story of harshness, of courage, and of the symbolic power of a frozen land at the far north. It is precisely this immense value that has turned king crab hunting into a spearhead industry of Alaska. More than 80% of the world's king crab supply comes from this sea, generating hundreds of millions of USD in annual revenue. That figure not only sustains thousands of fishing families, but is also tied to the local budget and national interests. In the bigger picture of the U.S. economy, king crab stands alongside other symbolic export products, from high technology to oil, because it helps shape the image of a superpower capable of exploiting every resource, even in the harshest regions. However, value lies not only in profit, but also in its ability to awaken human survival instincts and the aspiration to rise. For Alaskan fishermen, each king crab is not simply a commodity, but the crystallization of grit, inherited experience, and communal pride. They know that beneath the thick ice lies a chance to change their lives, but they are also fully aware that only discipline, skill, and precise calculation can help them seize that fleeting opportunity. King crab, therefore, is both a reward and a measure of organizational ability, and the fighting spirit of an entire generation. On a deeper level, the value of king crab also lies in the way it compels the entire political economic system to pay attention to sustainability. A resource too great can easily lead to overexploitation, and this challenge faces not only fishermen, but also the governments of Alaska and Washington. Thus, each million-dollar revenue figure is not only recorded in financial balance sheets, but also linked with the responsibility of conservation and resource management. In that way, the economic value of king crab has moved beyond luxury dishes to become a political issue, a card in America's strategy of managing and developing its marine resources. It can be said that king crab is proof of America's unique economic paradox, that the harshest, most dangerous things often bring the greatest profits. And it is precisely this that creates the lasting allure of the red gold of the Bering Sea, a value measured not only in USD, but also in faith, pride, and the symbolic power of a nation daring enough to explore lands once thought untouchable, drilling the ice and setting the traps. The classical art on the Bering Sea. If the immense value of king crab is the driving force that compels Alaskan fishermen to risk every danger, then the method of drilling the ice and setting the traps is the very ritual that defines the tradition of this trade. Not loud, not dazzling, it demands endurance, patience, and a skill honed through generations. In a place where every mistake can cost a life, precision and discipline become the prerequisites to enter the game. The familiar image of king crab season begins with massive drills placed on the thick ice surface. The thunderous sound of steel piercing through the hard ice signals not just a technical task, but evokes the feeling of opening a secret door leading into the deep world beneath the seafloor. Each hole drilled is not simply a trap door, but a passage connecting human survival to the natural treasure hidden under the cold black water. Only when the tons of heavy ice give way can the trap be lowered, beginning a silent yet dramatic journey. King crab traps are designed completely differently from ordinary fishing gear. They are a combination of refined mechanical engineering and deep understanding of the crab's biological behavior. Inside the massive steel frame lies a special bait, usually herring or cod, tied firmly in the center. The funnel-shaped structure allows crabs to crawl in easily, but makes it nearly impossible for them to escape. Every detail in the design reflects one simple truth. Humans cannot overpower nature, but they can be smarter in luring it. Setting the trap, which might seem simple, is in reality a test of intellect and experience. It is no coincidence that seasoned fishermen often possess the ability to read the sea. They look at the color of the ice, observe the wind direction, predict the movement of the currents, and from there determine the trap's placement. A trap lowered in the wrong spot may drift aimlessly, get stuck under the ice, or sink where no crabs appear. In that case, all effort and costs are lost. Conversely, a trap set in the right place becomes a mobile storage vault, collecting dozens or even hundreds of crabs after just a few days of waiting. Patience is the very essence of this method. Unlike trawl fishing, where results are immediate, drilling the ice and setting traps is a game of time. Fishermen must wait in the freezing cold, sometimes for many days, and then only hope when pulling the trap back up. The moment the massive trap is lifted from the water is always breathless. Will it hold a haul full of giant crabs, or just empty shells and a few stray fish? That feeling is like betting an entire fortune on a gamble, where nature holds the final card. What is noteworthy is that this method of drilling the ice and setting traps has created a sense of community bonding in the lives of Alaskan fishermen. No individual can complete this task alone. From the one operating the drill, to the one tying the trap, the one monitoring the currents, to the team pulling the trap up, all must work together tightly like a machine. This is not just a job, but proof of solidarity. An entire crew sharing the risks, enduring the cold, and finally sharing the reward. From a broader perspective, this traditional method also carries cultural values. It reminds us that no matter how advanced modern technology becomes, Alaska's fishing trade is still rooted in indigenous experience and understanding of nature. In a world increasingly reliant on automation, drilling the ice and setting traps stands as a symbol of high-end craftsmanship, where human intellect and perseverance still play the decisive role. This is also what creates the unique identity of Alaskan king crab. Not just seafood, but the crystallization of a labor process that is both classical and artistic. It is no exaggeration to say that drilling the ice and setting traps is the very soul of king crab fishing. It sharply depicts the intersection of humans and nature, of recklessness and calculation, of fear and hope. In each hole opened on the frozen sea lies the echo of history, of generations of fishermen who once staked their lives on this harsh land. And even today, that ritual continues, like a thread connecting past and present, linking the people of Alaska with the hidden treasure beneath the thick ice. Power in silence. If Canada's previous steps were explorations, experiments of strength in a turbulent global landscape, then at this stage, the strategy has taken on the shade of calmness. No longer hasty reactions, no longer loud declarations just to prove itself, Canada is now choosing to express power through silence. A silence that makes opponents cautious, allies attentive, and markets listen. That silence does not mean passivity, but rather absolute control. When Washington introduces more trade barriers, many countries immediately respond with harsh statements, while Canada chooses to adjust the rhythm through each technical document, each move to modify export standards. They do not create storms in the media, but they make America's supply chain gradually feel the pressure of missing a stable source of materials from the North. It is the art of a politics that understands that sometimes the greatest impact does not come from words, but from deliberate pauses. In closed-door meetings in Ottawa, trade memoranda are not written as lists of objections, but as strategic maps, where every line carries arrangements for the coming months, even years. Each clause, each new regulation on the control of agricultural products, minerals, or energy is carefully calculated by Canada, ensuring high standards while simultaneously creating subtle pressure on the American corporations dependent on them. A silent but weighty game where Canada does not need to shout to be noticed, but lets its very persistence force others to pivot. Within that silence, Canada also begins to strengthen new networks. Bilateral meetings with Europe, Japan, and especially Southeast Asian nations are not loudly promoted, but each signed commitment carries strong influence. This is no longer the act of seeking protection from traditional alliances, but the proactive creation of a new trade space, where Canada is not just a participant, but a pillar. This shift, ultimately, is the clearest response to the United States, only it is delivered in silence instead of being announced before television cameras. What is noteworthy is that this silence carries immense psychological power. Political rivals in Washington start to feel uncertain. What does Canada want, and how far will it go? That controlled ambiguity is the advantage when a smaller nation can make a superpower feel uneasy. Meanwhile, multinational corporations, far more sensitive to market realities, are forced to translate that silence into signals that Ottawa will not return to its old orbit, and they must prepare to adapt. Above all, that silence reflects a maturity of character. After decades of being tied to the image of America's compliant neighbor, Canada is now rewriting its own identity. This is not a loud rebellion, but a ripening process, when a nation is confident enough not to need to assert itself in words, but to let its quiet actions tell the story. In a global context shaken by extreme voices, Canada's controlled silence has become a sharp strategy. It not only protects national standing in the trade storm, but also creates a new standard of how power can be expressed. Once again, Canada proves real strength does not lie in who speaks the most, but in who is patient and wise enough to choose when to be silent, and to let that silence resonate farther than any declaration ever could. The boundary of control. When trade conflicts are no longer bilateral issues but have turned into a complex network stretching from Europe to Asia, from semiconductor supply chains to soybeans in the Midwest fields, the United States is forced to face a profound question. Do they still hold absolute control in an order they themselves once created? The answer is not simple, because in every policy move, we clearly see a fierce struggle between two forces. On one side, the instinct to maintain hegemony; on the other, the harsh reality that the world no longer operates under the linear logic of the 20th century. In recent years, Washington has often used tariff policy as a preemptive punch, from imposing duties on allies' steel and aluminum, to tightening restrictions on electronics and machinery from Asia. But instead of yielding, many partners have sought to restructure markets, disperse risks, and proactively diversify supply sources. Canada, Europe, Japan, or even Mexico, once allies deeply dependent on the U.S., are now among the pioneers in building safety belts against the instability emanating from the White House. This creates a bitter paradox. Each heavy-handed strike from the U.S. unintentionally encourages the world to move faster toward independence from it. In particular, multinational corporations, long considered satellites orbiting around the pull of the American market, are now recalculating. When production costs in the U.S. rise due to tariffs on imported materials, and when the risk of supply chain disruptions becomes increasingly present, quite a few companies have chosen a half-in, half-out approach, still maintaining a presence in the U.S., but at the same time investing in Southeast Asia, South America, or Africa as a hedge against volatility. The result is that the so-called power of control of the U.S. is no longer absolute, but only one among many gravitational poles in the multi-layered landscape of globalization. On the political front, this tug-of-war is even clearer. A segment of American voters, especially in industrial states that suffered heavy losses from free trade, support tightening economic borders. But another segment, those living in large cities where global integration has brought prosperity, remain wary of protectionism. The so-called control thus also becomes a dividing line within American society itself, between nostalgic past and complicated present, between the dream of returning to a golden era and the reality that the world has already taken a different turn. Yet, what is most frightening for Washington is not only the resistance from outside, but also the risk of losing the tools to shape the rules of the game. If in the last century the U.S. could impose standards through the IMF, WTO, or the dollar system, today those standards are being challenged. The de-dollarization initiatives appear in many places. New generation trade agreements no longer revolve around the U.S., and regional financial mechanisms are sprouting up as alternative options. Once the rules are no longer written by the U.S., the ability to control gradually becomes just a memory. However, it must be acknowledged that the United States will not easily accept retreat. They still hold strong cards. The dollar still accounts for a large share of global reserves. The American consumer market remains an important destination, and U.S. technology still leads in many cutting-edge fields. The problem is, each of those cards is gradually losing weight when used as tools of pressure rather than sources of trust building. And when trust is eroded, control cannot be maintained by sheer power alone. The boundary of control, therefore, no longer lies in absolute strength, but in the ability to maintain balance between pressure and cooperation. An America that knows restraint, that knows how to share, may still retain a central role. But an America that continues to choose the path of unilateralism and imposition will soon realize that control, once lost, will never return as it once was. A new line on the map of power. If Canada's earlier steps were about reclaiming breathing space amid the storm of trade wars, then by this stage, the story has turned into a profound reshaping of its position and the very nature of international relations. This is no longer just a battle of tariffs and economic interests, but a new front line, where Canada decides to challenge and assert its strength on the global map of power. In this picture, the United States still looms like a giant, but its power is no longer absolute. It is Washington's overconfidence, repeatedly wielding tariff policy as a weapon to bend its allies, that has become a loophole for Canada to exploit. Ottawa understands that when a superpower stumbles due to self-imposed isolation, the power vacuum becomes an opportunity for nations once considered peripheral to step in and redefine their value. What is striking is that Canada has not chosen a noisy path. There are no highly symbolic declarations on international forums, no shows of force before the media spotlight. Instead, Canada quietly signs more bilateral agreements with Southeast Asian countries, expands agricultural cooperation networks with South America, and gradually turns these connections into a soft defense line against U.S. pressure. It is precisely this persistence and patience that has led the world to begin realizing that Canada is no longer just a shadow beside its superpower neighbor, but is becoming a reliable intermediary force. On the other side, the United States is forced to face the reality that its bluff no longer makes Ottawa tremble. The numbers for Canadian exports of dairy, beef, and grains to markets outside the U.S. are beginning to grow significantly. This means that what Washington once considered a lever of coercion is gradually losing its effectiveness. The strength of a nation does not lie only in its military or technology, but also in its ability to build sustainable trade networks. And this is precisely what Canada is proving. More importantly, Canada has begun to open up for the world a new model. Not direct confrontation with a superpower, but a skillful redesign of the rules so that the superpower no longer holds monopoly over influence. This very path has made Canada a symbol of prudence in an era when many nations are easily swept away by waves of conflict and extremism. Looking deeper, this is also a new line on the global map of power. From a nation once seen as a satellite within America's orbit, Canada has carved itself into a small pole with its own gravity, thanks to trust and consistency in strategy. The name Canada is no longer tied to the image of the obedient northern brother, but to that of a partner capable of shifting balances in major economic games. This change not only affects U.S.-Canada relations, but also forces traditional allies to reconsider. Japan, South Korea, the European Union, all are beginning to see Canada as a soft counterbalance, a safe anchor when faced with Washington's pressure. And it is precisely in these movements that Canada is transforming itself into an indispensable player of a new order, where power is no longer concentrated in a few superpowers, but spread across multiple poles. That new line, once it has appeared, will be hard to erase. Canada has stepped into the realm of those who shape the rules, and the road ahead, though still full of challenges, will surely bring many opportunities for the nation to continue consolidating its rising position. Steps on new seas. Having moved past a defensive stance toward selective offense, Canada understands that the road ahead is not merely a series of confrontations with the U.S., but also a journey of seeking and asserting a sustainable foothold in a global order that is shaking. Entering this stage, The goal is not simply to protect short-term interests or create situational victories, but to open up new seas, where Canada can anchor its long-term vision, build an independent trade ecosystem, and create its own pull. What makes this strategy particularly appealing lies in how Canada approaches the matter. They do not seek to become a second superpower to replace the U.S., but aim to shape a mediating yet weighty role, where they become a bridge, a support, and a launch pad for other nations also seeking autonomy in a world divided by geopolitical competition. It is here that Canada begins to assert the mettle of a nation that does not chase the noisy drumbeat, but chooses to create its own melody. Subdued but enduring, quiet yet far-reaching. In the context of the U.S. increasingly imposing protectionist policies and turning inward, Canada reaches out to partners that had rarely been placed on the priority list before. Southeast Asian, African, or South American countries, emerging economies eager for stable food supplies and green technology, become the new seas for Canada to step into. There, it is not only about opportunities to expand markets, but also about the ability to build fair, environmentally friendly trade norms, aligned with the image of a modern, responsible, and sustainable Canada. Each of these steps, though not as shocking as tariff decisions or imposed sanctions, creates a gradually expanding network of influence. Canada knows that in this era, power is not measured only by military scale or massive capital flows, but also by trust and the ability to offer alternatives. When a South American country signs an agreement to import milk powder from Canada, instead of relying entirely on U.S. sources, that is not merely an economic deal, but a signal that the power board is shifting. What is notable is that Canada does not choose a solitary path. On the contrary, they turn to multilateral alliances, from CPTPP to new frameworks taking shape, to place themselves in a structure both flexible enough and steady enough. They do not want to create extreme polarization, but rather aim to build a space where the rules are fairer, where the voices of medium and small economies are heard. In a world where many nations feel trapped between the U.S. and China, Canada emerges as a promising side door. However, what makes this move dramatic is not only the trade agreements, but the change in strategic mindset. From a Canada long accustomed to sheltering under America's safety umbrella, now daring to place itself in turbulent waters, steering its own ship and accepting risks. It is this very boldness, with calculation, with preparation, that makes the world begin to see Canada differently. No longer the gentle shadow in the north, but a force capable of setting the rhythm in emerging regions. At this stage, the story is no longer about what Canada will do to respond to the U.S., but how the U.S. will respond to Canada's confident moves. For when a familiar partner suddenly turns into an indirect competitor, the board will not only shake, but also open new games, where the rules have never been defined. And that is the greatest allure. Canada is no longer walking the old path, but is creating new ones, even paths no one ever dared to imagine they would take.